Mark. Love, exactly. Good job, Bob. Gold star. Love. We identified how the entire law, all of it, all of the law was fulfilled in this perfect agape love of Christ. This agape, this completely, I forgot the word. Unconditional. There we go. And how we are called through his Spirit to exude the same loves to our neighbors around us. And then in the second half of the passage, we saw Paul's call to readiness. He urges the church to put away their connections to the world. Remember how Ongerth was talking about how battle in culturally was done in the daytime. Am I still breaking up, or am I okay? Okay, good. I'll try to keep speaking up. But battle happened during the day, and so Paul calls the church to put away the deeds of the night. The night is far spent, the day is upon them. And he says, listen, this is the time to put these lazy and fruitless actions of the night behind you. It's time for action. So the first half of chapter 13 is given to this idea of a Christian's responsibility to authority. And then the second half was written in regards to our relationships with other people. And so now we come to the start of chapter 14, and we encounter another teaching in our interactions with people, not with authority, but with fellow Christians. It's not our neighbors abroad. It now down to Christians within the church. So with that in mind, can I get someone to read the first 4 verses of chapter 14 of Romans? Thank you for unvolunteering for yourself, Bob. Oh, that sounded like thunder. Here's hoping that I don't disconnect in the middle of the study. That was not me. Nobody?
So do we stop on 4 or like?
Verses 1 through 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Okay, so you basically stop before you get to 5.
Correct.
All right. And it's 14, 1 through 12, right? Make sure I'm all right.
14, 1 through 4, yes.
I guess I'll go and read it.
Okay, go ahead, please.
So it says the danger of criticism, I guess, is what I have. Reading New Living Translation. Sorry, it says accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what they think is right or wrong. For instance, one person believes it's all right to eat everything, but another believer with a sensitive conscience will eat only vegetables. Those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't. And those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do. For God has accepted them. For who are you to condemn someone else's servants? Their own master will judge whoever they stand or fall, and with the Lord's help, they will stand and receive his approval.
All right, thank you.
Sorry about that.
All right.
I know I butchered a few words.
You're okay. So, if this idea of talking about food and struggles over food sounds familiar, well, you're not alone. There is another rather famous passage in the New Testament that deals with the idea of struggling with eating. You'll find it over in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. And what Paul is addressing there is he's talking about the Corinthian believers struggling with the idea of eating meat that has been sacrificed to idols or these false gods. Now, some Christians had no issue with it, while others struggled with this idea. So here in Romans, it's a bit of a similar idea, but the direction that Paul goes with it is different. It's not the same idea. Over in 1 Corinthians, it was the idea of don't cause your brother to stumble. The idea of Christian liberty versus Christian love. Here, Paul initially takes a bit of a different direction. So this takes some explaining, because as you read through this, you kind of get the feeling that, or not just the feeling, it actually kind of comes out and says it, that who Paul is really addressing here is not the person who's eating the meat, but the person who isn't, the person who is offended by the person that's eating the meat. And so that's a bit of a flip side from what we had gotten before, or not before, but in the other passage in Corinthians. So let's back up and take a little bit of a quick history lesson in regards to what's going on here. See, the problem that's going on here is rests in the dichotomy of the church at this point, namely the fact that the church at this point is made up of both Jews and Gentiles. For the Gentiles, the Gentiles are like completely brand spanking new to this relationship with God. They've had no encounters with Him before. The ministry of Paul and a few other of the apostles have brought the Gentiles into the light. They've come to God, but they have no real prior experience. And so whatever Paul teaches them, they just kind of take at face value. And so this whole idea of Christian liberty, and there's nothing, and the law of the Jews doesn't play into them. There's no need for the sacrifices and everything. And there's this wonderful idea of Christian liberty that the Gentiles just very freely accept. But on the other side of the equation, there are the Jews, and the Jews have a bit of a history with God. And specifically, there's this group, this religious sect of the Jews known as the Essenes. And the Essenes are this religious sect that were really just very, they favored heavy adherence to the Mosaic law, to the point that many of them were vegetarians, just straight up. Some did eat meat, but generally speaking, they would only eat meat if it was prepared specifically by them, like if it was prepared by the Essenes. If it was prepared by anybody else, they're like, yeah, nah. If you wanted a good idea of what these guys were like, think Jewish monks. And I know that sounds funny, but it's not inaccurate. Anyway, the Essenes seemed to have been drawn to the church, and it's not out of the idea of these Judaizers, which were seeking to corrupt the church and pollute it. But some of the Essenes came earnestly out of an honest desire to follow Christ, and it's not unlikely that many of them were actually converted and became Christians. But the problem was that they had these prejudices and predispositions from their upbringing that they brought with them into the church, and as a result, they struggled with the idea of eating meat because of their past. And so when they get there and they see these Gentiles who had no prior history with God, no real issue with it, and they see this, things got awkward. Because you have these guys that don't eat meat in this church with guys that have no problem eating meat, and it just, yeah. You guys with me? You understand that? Good? Anybody here? Okay. But you guys are with me, right? Clear as mud?
Yeah, I got you. I'm following.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure. I don't want to leave anybody behind. So Paul understands the issue. He's heard about it. And so he says, look, we've talked, we're hopefully getting to the latter half of this letter. I feel like I can address some of these issues. So he does do so with a little bit of apostolic intervention. So he basically comes out, excuse me, first part of chapter 14, he says, look, guys, for those that eat the meat, don't just act like it's nothing that your brother takes issue with it. Don't act like there's no big deal, that it's just nothing of any consequence. That's not acting in love, and just put that one on the back burner. We'll come back to that next week, the idea of acting in love, but that's next week's. This week we're going to focus on it in a different topic. He says, as for you that don't eat, listen up. I got some instructions for you. So the term that's used here for past judgment in verse 4, the Greek word is krino. I can't highlight in the text. There we go. Bam, there we go. That's the Greek word. And it literally means judge or to decide. It's very often used as a legal term, which it tends to coincide with the idea of a judge declaring or deciding if someone is guilty or innocent. And so in this context, it really reveals the state of mind of this person who abstains from the meat. Whether it was intentional or not, this person who doesn't eat the meat looks down on their brothers and sisters, and they judge them as being in the wrong for their dining choices. So there are two problems with this that Paul points out. First, he says, who are you to judge that? If God welcomes the meat eater, and by the way, he does, then what right do you have to try and accuse this person of being in the wrong? And secondarily, how prideful are you to try and stand in the place of God? So Paul goes on. He says in verse 4, he says, look, listen up. The master of this brother of yours, and by the way, your master too, Jesus Christ, he is the one who declares this man righteous or unrighteous, not you or anyone else. And I got news for you. Christ will uphold him because Christ can. He's the only one that can declare him righteous, and he can. Now, if you just you don't even really have to read between the lines that much. You can kind of see where Paul falls on this issue of whether or not it's okay to eat the meat. But we'll come back to this next week. All right. Lost my place. So that's first 4 verses. Can I get someone to read verses 5 through 9? Hey, Wash. Go ahead, sir.
One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For, for if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living.
Thank you. All right. So in the first 4 verses, we see that we're judging people based on food. In these verses, we see that there's this judging happening of people based on days. And that just sounds dumb, right? It's like some people, verse 5, one person thinks one day is better than another person thinks all days are just as good as every other one. What's going on here? Paul's just start talking about esteeming days and some kind of nonsense. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it seems completely off the wall when you consider the context of the last 4 verses. Anybody know what we're talking about here? Any ideas on what we might be referencing in this passage, in these 5 verses? Good guess, Bob. Astrology. Sabbath. Okay. Aha. Okay. So in doing some research, there's actually a little bit of debate. Not a big one. Most people tend to go on one side of this debate as to whether this is talking about the preference of which day should be the day of rest, either Saturday, which was the Sabbath to the Jews, or Sunday, which is generally regarded as the Lord's Day in New Testament times, or if this is talking about the Jewish feasts that were instituted in the Mosaic Law. Most people, most of the commentaries and the scholars that I checked out would side with the doctor's answer here, which is that this is referencing Jewish feasts. Possibly the Sabbath. I tend to agree with the idea of the Jewish feasts personally, because I like to go with the flow. But let's give a little background. So you guys remember those Essenes from the first 4 verses? Yeah, this is more their stuff. See, their strict adherence to the Mosaic Law caused them to observe things that the Gentiles didn't have any real appreciation for, like the Jewish holidays. So as a result, these Essenes, these Jewish Christians, would view these particular holidays as holier or more important than other days. And they would often use those days for fasting or observing certain traditions based on the day. And as a result, because they view themselves as adhering to the law and viewing these days in a certain light, they use this as ammunition against the Gentiles who just straight up didn't really care. They had no reason to care. And so they kind of looked at these Gentiles again as less holy or whatever. So now that's something else that Paul has to address. So this going back to what we said about fasting, fasting on these days for the Essenes, that's what he says about observing versus eating. If you were observing the holiday, then chances are you were fasting from it. And if you're eating on that day, that means you probably weren't observing it. You weren't fasting. You were going to be eating as opposed to taking a fast on the Jewish holiday. And then he comes to verse 7, and he says that none of us lives or dies to himself. What does that mean? Good answer, Kessa. Well, you know my thing. The Bible's the greatest commentary on itself. So why don't we read ahead a verse and find out what Paul means? You go ahead to verse 8, and he says, if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. The idea is this. Our actions don't serve our own selves, but they are done with the intent of glorifying God and in deference to God. This is what Paul means back in verse 5 when he says that each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. It's not a matter of spiritual truth. If you observe the holiday, that's cool. If you don't and choose not to fast, that's cool too. But the overarching principle is that in whatever you do choose to do, you do it for the glory of God. Make sense? Awesome. Now the last little phrase of verse 9 is interesting, but it exists to grant perspective and some scope. It says that to this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. So yeah, we know Jesus died, and we know that he rose again. That's the gospel in a nutshell right there. And we know that he did this to offer redemption to all mankind. But do you ever consider that that's only possible because Jesus at one point was alive and at another point was dead, but he was Lord the entire time. He was Lord as he lived, and he was Lord as he died. As a result, he is master of both the living and the dead, and he has claim over both. That's why when you go to Matthew 28 at the Great Commission, the very first thing that Jesus says is, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Need to hurry up. I'm running out of tea in my glass. I'd call you out on your misspelling of communion, but I don't care. I really don't care.
Oh boy.
All right. So I will take the last few verses. Verses 10 through 12, because I hear the rain outside and I'm worried that I might not stick around much longer.
It's coming.
Why do you?
Too.
Sorry. Verses 10 through 12. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. So we've been judged on food, we've been judged on days, but the big point is in verses 10 through 12, we are judged by God. So in light of the last 9 verses, Paul asks the question. He says, why do you judge your brother? And why do you, the other guy over there, the one that you're judging, why do you despise the guy that's judging you? The word for you here in the original Greek, it's incredibly emphatic. It's like it's drawing extra attention to it because there's a huge contrast that exists between this Christian who is kind of erroneously regarding his brother, whether despising him as his opinion doesn't matter, or judging him because he's in the wrong, or perceived as being in the wrong, and between the perfect judge, God himself. And Paul uses a word you may have heard before. He says that we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. Now, the word judgment seat here, if you've taken a course in eschatology or studied the end times at all, you may have heard a particular Greek word referenced, or a particular event established that occurs. It refers to the judging of the saints by Jesus Christ, not the great white throne judgment, which happens for the unredeemed at the end of the millennial kingdom, but prior to that, there is a judging of all the saints, and this happens at what is called the Bema seat. And this is the word that Paul uses here. This is where we get the term Bema seat. It refers back to this throne where God will judge his followers for their deeds, and it's the place where he will either bestow or withhold rewards for the deeds that are done in the service of Jesus Christ. You hear about the crowns that are going to be given to the saints. This is what we're talking about here. Okay? So what Paul is saying is that it's not our responsibility to try and judge our brothers and sisters over semantic things like observing holidays, eating meat, or whatever. What matters is whether our actions were done in the Spirit of God to bring him honor and glory. Then you come to verse 12, and there's this twofold exhortation. First, it says each of us will give an account of himself to God. First encouragement or reminder here is that we all answer to God for our actions. He is the judge that we will have to answer to. Every single one of us will answer to him. Right? All agreed? Yep. It is a scary concept when you consider a lot of things. We all know our own minds, and it's scary, but we will all stand before God. We will give an account of our actions in our lives. But the second thing is a little more subtle, but it's just as poignant, and I think it's the one that Paul wanted to get across a little bit more. It shows that when God asks about our lives, he'll ask about our lives, not our neighbors. Therefore, our primary concern shouldn't necessarily be about the sanctity of our brother's actions, although it's not something we should completely ignore, because we are called to bear each other's burdens, and we have passages talking about discipline within the church, and if your brother be fallen, he's got that little speck in his eye or something. We're to be concerned about our brother's actions, but it's not over semantic things. Our concern needs to be with the sanctity of our own lives, since one day we will be demanded to give an account for it. So what? So what? What's the point? Look, I personally know it is easy to get caught up in semantics. It is very simple. It's especially easy here in America. I mean, just think about some of the stuff that we see that we'll judge people on. Just kind of, look at them and say, well, I did better than them or something. Just think of some of these things. Every November, every first Tuesday in November, voting. Did you vote? Did you vote? Did you vote? It was like we're having a pairing contest. You know, we recently had Memorial Day. How many people went to a cemetery to visit gravestones of military people? You know, volunteering of any kind, just going out and helping people or volunteering within the church or whatever. Community service, all sorts of things like that. And even in the church, it runs rampant. This idea of judging people based on their behavior, the way they act, or appearances. You know, it's like if you're singing a song and you raise a hand, oh goodness, if you raise a hand kind of way, it's like, oh my goodness, that person's like having a spiritual encounter, or you're just like, oh, they're showing off. It's just judgment. Heaven forbid you raise two. We judge people over the preferences of kinds of music that they like. You know, we'll judge people over whether or not they say amen when the pastor reaches a certain really good point in his sermon. You know, I'm guilty of this one, dissecting prayers, and then I try to count how many times the guy who was praying said Lord to the prayer. I've done that. And it's silly. It's completely silly. But these are all things that we use to try and gauge ourselves and think of people and compare them to ourselves. I get it. I'm really guilty of this. You know, full stop. I am guilty of this. Pretty much every single one of those that I just named, you could just mark me down as yep, failed, every single one. But this is why this passage is so important. Paul reminds us that it's not about any of that. It's not our place to judge someone on their actions where sin isn't involved. That's God's rule. He's the highest judge, and we'll all answer to him one day. But you know, I think Paul put it best. He said, so, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Your thoughts, guys? No thoughts! Incoming checks mix warning. Go ahead, wife.
Franco. Well, my thought is just kind of thinking recently what happened to me during the Discord debate is that, you know, it really bothered me, and on a spiritual level, and then on a biblical level. And I think it's important that it shows that they're showing both sides. Don't judge someone for not eating. Don't judge someone for eating, because either way, you're judging someone, and that's basically what happened.
To a certain degree. I think there's interesting distinctions to be made. I think this is an important one. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I am saying that there are judging people based upon an idea of holiness. There are other things judging, being discerning in trying to preserve a sense of peace and harmony and unity. So I'm not saying it was one way or another, but I am saying that the pursuit of holiness relative to each other versus one of trying to preserve a sense of harmony within the community as such can be two different things.
I'm talking about preserving holiness.
I'm sorry?
And I was talking about preserving holiness.
Okay. And Ketzer brings up a really good point there. Loving people and praying for them makes it really hard to be judgy or judgmental. I don't know, I like judgy more. And that's something we're going to cover more next week. It's not supposed to be me, who knows? But I trust that Ongarth will take this one. Because this week we really only covered the Essene, the Jewish side of the argument, from those that wanted to stick with the Mosaic law and were really offended by these Gentiles that had virtually no respect for the Mosaic law. Next week, we're going to cover the other side of the argument.
Scribe, is there any time as a Christian that it's okay to judge?
Ooh. There is,
I'd say no.
well, I'm not going to let you get off the hook that easy, Lindland. Can you back that up with scripture?
Well, I just said there, say because it sits there and says, "Do not judge, for you'll be judged back." Yes.
It says, judge not lest you be judged in like manner.
Ah.
The manner in which you judge, you will be judged in.
I mean, like, if it was a Christian doing occult activities.
Okay. I think you need to, there needs to be a certain parameter established there,
Okay.
because in my mind, judge carries different connotations, and Kessler picked up on it very quickly. Because when we say judge, that can mean a number of different things. So what do you mean by judge?
What I mean by the judging of it is when someone, for instance, practicing the occult, like how to remind them that that is wrong, but not
Okay.
to judge them.
Okay, so let's analyze the word judge. When we think of judge, the image that comes to mind, I have more tea. The image that comes to mind for most people is going to be of the judge, Law and Order, or Perry Mason or something, the dude that sits up high on the bench in front of the entire court and giving verdicts. And so if we're talking about that kind of judging, then no. There's not, I don't believe there's a point where a Christian is ever given the authority to condemn someone in one form or another. That's not our role. We are not the judge. We have a higher judge. But at the same time, the Christian is called to judge and be discerning,
What's that mean?
to be able to tell the difference between something, be able to look at something and determine whether that is right or wrong, to judge an item, to judge a situation, to judge an action, and be able to say, okay, that is evil or that is good, and to be able to discern and tell the difference between the two. And so in that regard, yes, the Christian needs to be needs to judge all the time.
So it's a very
because
thing to do.
because of the negative connotation that often comes with the word judge, most people don't use it in that idea. They use the term discernment.
Thank you, Scribe.
You're welcome. Oh, Futron Bob. I just saw your post because I was in my swivel chair scooting across the kitchen to the fridge. But Bob pulls out the Bible and lays down the scripture right there. Well done. I think I would. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say in that scripture that Bob just put out there, are all those the same Greek word for judge?
I honestly don't know. I mean, I could break out my concordance and find out. Let's see.
Because it seems like it'd be different words. I know in English we get lazy and just say, oh, it's judge.
Oh yeah, yay for lazy English. English is the most lazy language. We barely use words anymore. We just acronym everything.
Just ambiguously grunt.
Now the Greeks, if there's one thing the Greeks did, they understood that different words, or they had different words for different meanings. They were really good about that. So if there are different words for judge, then I'm sure they will probably come up. But I would have to do a little more study at Greek emojis for, oh gosh, what have you people done? Let's see, 1 Corinthians 5:12. I feel like I should know this verse. $5:12. No, for what have I to do with judging outside, not inside those inside the church whom you are to judge? Okay, yep. My grandmother thinks our language is devolving back to hieroglyphics because of emojis. Oh my goodness. It's kind of scary how accurate she could be. Nothing new under the sun. We're just cycling back around. All right. Before we get into the post-study discussion, I do want to close out in prayer because I have been lax about that recently.